Hello. We're on page 13 of 30 Years of Watchtower Slave by William Schnell, and we're in the first chapter, It Appeared So Harmless, and now he's telling the story of his getting involved with the Watchtower. Stranded by War is the subtitle. I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey in the year of 1905, and at the age of 9 was taken by my parents on a trip to their homeland, Germany. This trip was undertaken in the early spring of 1914, the month of May to be exact, when war seemed very remote. When it finally became clear that war would break out, my parents tried desperately to get passage to the USA, but in vain. My father, not as yet being a citizen of the USA, but having his first papers, was soon drafted in the armed forces of the Central Powers, having been a reserve officer before emigrating to America. He had to leave my mother, myself, and a brother, sister, and another sister, to be born in September, behind. We acquired 4 acres of land and a house in the eastern province of Posen in Germany, situated only about 16 kilometers from the Russian border. War had broken out only a fortnight before, but already the Russians were swarming all around us in the woods, infiltrating the entire border area. Then suddenly, our whole region became an armed camp. Soldiers were quartered in all our homes, bivouacked in the fields around us. The Germans were preparing for a grand offensive, the hub of which was being driven home on the fields of Tannenberg in East Prussia, where von Hindenburg annihilated vast Russian armies. The rumble of cannon could be heard in the distance. Then one morning began a 3-day march of tens of thousands of Russians who had been taken prisoner through our village, which was situated on a main highway in the east. Thereafter the battlefield advanced deep into Russia. During all that time we had not heard from our father. Finally, in early 1915, we did get word from him. But in the great strategic retreat of the Austro-German armies in early 1916, under General Mackensen, when the Central Powers evacuated all Galicia, the division in which my father served was assigned to hold the Russians back in a rearguard action below, this word is strange, Przemysl. It's spelled P-Z-E-M-I-S-C-H-L. There they held the entire Russian army for 72 hours, allowing the main forces to retreat behind the Carpathian Mountains. Needless to say, the division was completely decimated. The company my father was in was reduced to only 7 effectives, and these ragged remnants found their way through the mountains passes into Hungary. Again, during all this time, we had no word from our father, and our hearts were heavy. It was specifically in this period of time that I became receptive to the message of Jesus Christ in the parable of the Good Samaritan. My father was allowed to stay in Hungary to recuperate for 6 months. In the meanwhile, the Austro-German counteroffensive succeeded and drove the Russians out of Galicia and deep into Volhynia, far into the Ukraine, liberating Galicia. Congress, Poland, and other eastern areas, which were largely denuded of inhabitants, had to furnish much-needed food supplies for the army. Teams of officers were formed in Hungary and were given charge of thousands of Russian prisoners who were to farm these vast areas. My father belonged to such a team of 3 officers, which was given charge of a large estate on the river San below Lemberg. During this time, my father had a wonderful opportunity to practice Christianity. He helped wherever he could, and dealt squarely with friendly with these poor mushiks of the Russian steppes, whereas his fellow officers were harsh and cruel. This situation obtained until fall of 1918, when the Austro-German armies collapsed in the east and found themselves trapped in the midst of Slavish people who bitterly hated the Germans. Slavish, I don't know if that's even a word, but he means Slavs anyway. Slavish people who bitterly hated the Germans. The Russian prisoners broke loose and first killed off all the German officers they could lay their hands on. Remembering the good things my father had done for them, the Russian prisoners captured my father and whisked him away in the dark of the night, put him upon a fleet horse, and guided him through all the confusion and breakdown of order in eastern Galicia from Lemberg to Przemysl. There my father was able to board a freight train which brought him safely into Krakow 3 weeks later, a trip which normally took 12 hours by freight train. From there he was able to get a train to Breslau, where he was eventually mustered out. Late in December 1918, close to Christmas, Father walked into our home. What a joy! But it was only short-lived. Early in January 1919, Polish insurgent forces jumped the gun and began occupying the province of Posen, in which we lived, and which had been ceded to them by the armistice. Once again, our village became a battleground. One time my brother and I, caught in a house between a school in which were stationed German troops and their home, had to spend considerable time in a potato cellar while machine guns barked overhead. Finally, the German forces capitulated, and such citizens as my father were interned as hostages. For a while, the future looked dark, since many of the internees who were former officers and officials were being shot. One night, a bandit group carried out a raid for food in our village. They took all our food from us and lined up the women, among whom was my mother, as hostages. It looked for a while as if the leader was going to have all the women shot. I crept up close to my mother, who, as I could see, kept up her usual courage. I had a German dagger concealed under my sleeve, for I had resolved that at the moment he gave command to shoot, I would plunge the dagger into his back. But thanks to the Lord, that contingency did not arise. The command was not given, and the women eventually released. In early 1921, we were herded into cattle cars and shipped across Poland to the new German frontier, and there turned over to the Germans. There German officials took us in hand, shipped us to a refugee camp in the western section of Berlin. The day we arrived in Berlin, the Spartakists, a nickname for the commies in those days, were fighting pitched battles in the streets with Republican troops. Everything was topsy-turvy, but at long last we were comparatively safe. Next time I become involved, that is, with the Watchtower, I'll put in a link to something relevant to all of this, which is what were the witnesses saying in those days about who was fulfilling Matthew 24:14, because they believed, of course, 14, they'd be very likely in heaven, so that God could turn his attention to things on earth, and would have the legal right to do so when the Gentile times expired. So who fulfilled Matthew 24:14 according to Russell and the Russellites? Put that link on your screen. See you next time.